Well, welcome everyone to the art lecture series. Today we have Christian Nagler, and but coming up, I just wanted to say that we have in week 6, November 4th, Anna Springer and Anne DeMarkin, who will be speaking, both writers, on white girlhood, and there'll be a facilitated conversation that Miranda Mellis and I will have with them after they talk. And then in week 8, we have Dalia El-Sayed and Andrew Demergen, who work collaboratively with sound and kind of interactive work. So those are going to be excellent. I just want to remind everyone, after the talk, after Christian speaks with us for about an hour, we'll have a Q&A session, which is the time when we have sort of lively conversations and interact. So please come forward and ask your questions and add your comments. You can do it 2 ways, one of 2 ways, either raising your hand and then you can ask in person, or you can write it in the Q&A. It would be great. We love to hear student voice. So if you are willing and want to, please ask in person. So we have Jordan Silvera here from Foundational Studio Projects, who will be introducing Christian. Thanks, Jordan.
Being among those who dedicate themselves to a life and passion of creativity, we as artists have no choice but to step on the overgrown and tumultuous road of self-reflection and face ourselves and the things we fear. As we make our trek along this eerie path of mirrors, we will inevitably encounter splinters of ourselves that we didn't know existed, and many will remain unseen, continuing to influence our steps in unknown ways. Today, we will be joined on that path that we all share by Christian Nagler, a man of many achievements and creations. Today, he steps forward with us to share some of his deep thoughts and wisdom. Although he is a graduate of Berkeley, a published writer, a translator, and an artist, Christian is also a Sherlock Holmes of sorts, delving deep into the minds of his proverbial adversaries, regardless of the fear he may feel in doing so. He collects each morsel of information until he finally culminates his findings to create his works of art. If you don't understand now, I suspect if you keep listening, you probably will. Without further ado, Christian Nagler.
Wow. Thanks so much, Jordan. That was such a beautiful introduction. Yeah. I am extremely honored to be speaking with you today. Thanks for making the time to listen to me and to see a little bit of what I've been working on and in the past and in the present. And I just want to thank particularly Miranda Mellis, for my old friend Miranda Mellis, for inviting me to speak here. Also Shah Osha, who I was just talking with a little bit, for organizing this. Jordan Silvera, for that wonderful introduction. And to Dave Crampton for handling the tech, and everyone there. So thank you so much. I'm going to give you just a little bit of an outline, a little plan, how I'm going to go about this talk, and then I'll go into it. So first, I'm going to give just a brief description of what I see as the overarching concerns of my work, a little bit about how I go about conceiving it and making it. Then I will go through a little brief tour of 3 pieces that I made, 3 projects that I worked on before this particular kind of current period that I'm in now, which is mostly that I've been doing research for the past 4 or 5 years, not as much artwork, and definitely not any much artwork during this last strange year, which is also I want to say that I do wish that I was there in person, and not speaking to you over this device, but this is where we're at. So yeah, I'll go through a couple pieces that were the kind of last, according to me, kind of bigger projects that I've done before this last period of research. I'll show some images, a little bit of video, a little audio of those pieces. And then during the kind of second half of what I'm going to present, I will kind of give a presentation of part of the research that I've been doing over the last 5 years, which has been ethnographic research in Silicon Valley, with an eye towards making artwork out of this research. But I'm not quite there yet. So right now I'm in this kind of intermediary period of research. So yes, so let's see, what I see as the overarching concerns of my work, and when I go back through it, what I see in the work is a thoroughgoing interest that seems to persist for me in bringing together different systems, juxtaposing them, and kind of letting them speak to each other in different ways. And the systems that I work with seem to always have kind of two characters to them. On the one hand, large scale kind of economic, ideological, often technological systems, techno-economic systems, how they occur kind of in discourse, in mind, in devices, in our everyday environments. And on the other hand, kind of bodily, psychic, emotional systems. So really, I think what I'm thinking of when I think of a work to do, when it kind of, an idea comes to me about some work to do, it usually has to do with, like, I want to see what happens when a bodily system and a kind of large scale system, usually it's a system that I don't like and that scares me and that I don't understand. I want to see what happens when they come together in ways that I haven't seen, and what comes out of that. So I think maybe I'll just jump into the projects now, and this will give you a more tangible sense of what I'm talking about with bodily systems and, on the other hand, techno-economic or large-scale ideological systems. So I'm gonna share my screen here and go into the projects. Okay. Can everyone see this? Is my screen sharing all right?
Yes.
Great, thank you. All right, so the first project I'm going to talk about was a project that I did over a few years, starting, I believe, in about 2011. I think around 2009-10 is when I started doing the research for this piece, and this gets me into something that Jordan talked about in his introduction, is that my process in pretty much any piece or work or project is that I spend at least a few years of research, researching the kind of large scale system that I am interested in understanding and presenting, and affecting and playing with. And then after a few years of research, then I start to kind of conceive of the specificity of the work that I'm making. And most of the work that I make is performance, I should say that too. Although sometimes I make video And sometimes they come together in different ways, as they did in this project Market Fitness that I did between the years of 2010 and 2014. And I'm just going to read like a little description that I just wrote this morning of what I was trying to do in Market Fitness, because I didn't want to leave anything out. So,
Chris, can you expand the image?
Oh yeah. Oh, thanks. Thank you. Forgot about that. All right. So when the market for financial derivatives was launched in 1973, it took less than 2 decades to grow into the largest market in the world. And it is a market hardly ever seen directly, but rather, as this project kind of posits, kinesthetically intuited in terms of the high value of circulation relative to real production of commodities. And so I'm thinking a lot about circulation in this piece. And I thought of it almost as a kind of critique of the idea of circulation, both of circulation of value within a larger economic systems and the idea of the value of the circulatory system and working the circulatory system. And so those are the two kind of systemic aspects that I was trying to bring together, was bodily circulation and value circulation in the larger economy. So I wrote here, we might feel this shift into the derivatives market as a hyperactive increase in motion and communication, as seemingly irreconcilable rifts between the needs of the body and the demands of the monetary system, or as resistant impulses to establish our own more tangible circuits of accountability. Whether fatal or profitable, however, the question remains, how do we exist as ordinary bodies in relation to unlisted virtual offshore entities that operate in an unregulated electronic space using secret proprietary trading strategies to buy and sell arcane financial instruments upon which, in certain senses, many of our survivals depend, strangely and kind of terrifyingly. So this set of participatory performances that I did, called Market Fitness, experimented with how to respond physically to the scale and opacity of global finance. I developed the project amid the fallout of the 2008 financial crisis as part of the organizing explosion of the Occupy movement, when popular pedagogies of finance were emerging as new forms of economic vernacular. So this was during the Occupy movement, when a lot of people were concerned with developing understandings of the financial system that could be spread around in a sort of clear and accessible way that many people could kind of understand and respond to. So against and with these pedagogies, this project Market Fitness juxtaposed the movement vocabulary of the aerobic workout with accounts of the global financial system. So this was basically what I did was I conducted these fitness classes, or these aerobics classes, that were simultaneously lectures or lessons in particular functions of the global financial system. So people would come to these aerobics classes and they would be put through this kind of series of pretty difficult and rigorous aerobic sequences, and at the same time kind of asked to understand and kind of listen to and comprehend these lessons about the global financial system. And this was the liability release form that I had participants read and sign before each session. It's a kind of a form of writing that I have returned to a lot over the years, is the form of the liability release form. And you'll see there's another project that I'll present that also played with the liability release form. And I won't read this, but I assume maybe some of you have been looking at it. So working alongside a virtual avatar, this was a video avatar of myself broadcasting from various sites marked by economic systems and economic violence, including the former Pacific Coast Stock Exchange in San Francisco, which was actually the kind of place where electronic trading was invented. And it has since kind of gone under, and the neoclassical building that it was housed in has become now an Equinox gym that I did some work in, and I'll show you a picture of that. So the Pacific Coast Stock Exchange, I went to oil refineries, cattle fields, and also foreclosed homes in the Bay Area. I brought the two practices together of financial pedagogy and aerobics in a kinesic experiment in information processing. So the lessons that I tried to teach, they questioned the practical, moral, and theological bases of our financial infrastructure at the same time as they attempted to recode the information somatically. So I was thinking a lot about the way that we learn about financial systems via particular kind of talking heads and disembodied voices. And I wanted to kind of see what would happen when there was a environment of learning about the financial system in a way where bodies were very activated, also possibly going towards exhaustion, but also just kind of energized and activated. I was just wondering what would happen if that was experimented with. So these lessons integrated extremes of effort, exhaustion, and also deep relaxation with the cognitive endurance of understanding systems. The research for these lessons came from ongoing conversations that I held with experts in the financial world, traders, financial engineers, and economists that I would go and have conversations with. And this was first done at this place here in the Bay Area called the Headland Center for the Arts in spring 2012. And it was subsequently staged at galleries and museums, and also at a lot of gyms and fitness stores and community centers. I was doing this for a couple of years after, and frankly got pretty tired of it after doing it many times, but it had its moment, really. So here are some images from the performance as well as from the video avatar. This is me kind of leading some of the motions out in this cow pasture, because partly what I was talking about here was the market in cattle futures. Here is an oil refinery that I was doing the exercises in when I was talking about crude oil futures, the way that market works. In front of a gold and pawn shop. I was talking about also the gold commodity market. And this was one of the foreclosed homes that I was also leading the motions from. This is the old Pacific Stock Exchange, as I was saying, where the electronic trading market was born. And now it's this big gym. This is the inside of that gym. So I think one thing to say also is that a lot of these pieces that I've done, at the same time that, like I said, they bring systems together, economic systems and bodily systems. Also for me, I think part of what I like to do in these pieces is to really investigate sites and the way that systems inscribe sites, and then what happens when you bring the bodily into that site. So the second piece that I'm going to talk about is somewhat similar in a certain way to market fitness, although I only did it once. It was called cosmoconvulsive anxiophenics. This was, I think I did it in 2014. It was summer of 2014. And similar to market fitness, I was trying to bring together a bodily system and a large kind of economic ideological system. But in this case, the two systems were, on the one hand, a kind of slightly obscure, maybe to some, somatic form of kind of group therapy from the 1960s and 70s called Reichian somatics, which is a process, some of you might be familiar with it. It mostly consists of different exercises that you do that are mostly based around this very, very intense form of hyperoxygenating breathing that starts to produce these kind of vulnerabilities in the body that are supposed to soften and get rid of what Wilhelm Reich, who developed this, who was an Austrian psychoanalyst, he thought of as the sort of forms of bodily armor that we carry in our bodies that are integral to large-scale formations of authoritarian political systems and fascist political systems. It's kind of like what he thought of as the bodily vessel or kind of medium of large-scale ideologies of fascism. These were therapies that were supposed to dislodge those bodily armors. And so I thought that I would this was a therapy that I had actually done years before and I was pretty familiar with and had been studying for a while, and I was kind of interested in it, kind of in a sort of freaky way, but also in like, I was interested in the boldness of its claims. So in this piece, what I wanted to do was to see what would happen when I conducted one of these group Reichian somatic therapy sessions, but also combined with it a sort of lesson in the kind of nitty gritty or like ins and outs of the global risk management industry. So here again is the liability waiver that I had participants think about before they did this. And here is a very grainy picture of part of the performance. And this is me kind of leading the crowd. And part of what the Reichian somatics also consists of is this, how to put it, like screaming, very, very loud screaming for periods of time, kind of screaming until you're exhausted. So this was kind of the climax of the session. Here is earlier in the session, and people were doing a sort of breathing and kind of bioenergetic exercise. Another similar picture. And so what I was thinking I was going to do with this piece, to give you a sense of it, I also made an audio track, a sort of audio piece of this performance that kind of tried to kind of make it so that people could listen to this audio track and follow along and do the, listen to the lecture on risk management and also do the exercises. So I was going to play part of that audio track for you, just to give you a sense of what this was like. So hopefully you'll be able to hear this.
What are risk managers? They coordinate between interests, experts, lawyers, insurance analysts, the media, and the public. Who do they work for? They work for transnational and national regulatory bodies like the WTO and WHO. They work for large corporations, especially in high-risk, low-trust industries such as chemical weapons, GMOs, and investment banks. They work for large institutions like universities, museums, and airports. They work for risk management consultancy firms such as Aon, RMS, QRM, Lloyd's, McKinsey and Company, Accenture, Risk Dynamics, SunGard, and PricewaterhouseCoopers. What do? They define and describe the institution's risk appetite and create the risk culture of an institution. They look for creeping signs. They provide or not empirical justifications for regulation via 1. Scientific risk assessment, 2. Quantitative economic analysis. Both of these are combined and set against public opinion. No regulation without evidence. No regulation without evidence. No regulation without evidence.
Okay, one more clip from this, from the end of the session where we're doing the screening, just so you can hear.
American tobacco companies and their risk management subsidiaries have been the largest global lobbyists for strict, evidence-based approaches to risk analysis. Take a deep breath in and begin yelling and screaming with your full voice. Allow each scream to be louder, longer, and fuller than the last.
Okay. So one thing I want to say before I go on to the next piece that I wanted to show you was that, when I look back on this piece, which was from 2014, about 6 years ago, it really has me thinking about how much things have changed and how, to me, this piece felt like it was, when I was making it, it was kind of on the verge of a world or a life that felt like it was being impinged upon, but also attempted to, the risk management industry globally was kind of attempting to manage the risk, to manage levels of danger, to quantify the probabilities of risk, and to sort of operate the global economy on that basis. And now it seems like that has failed, basically. So looking back on it, it almost feels like it was on the precipice of something that now I feel like I'm living in, actually. So that piece was first performed at a art space in San Francisco called The Lab, but then it subsequently went to, actually it was performed in Taipei, and this is a picture of the performance in Taipei. It was part of this art space at Taipei that was working with the Bangkok Biennale. So I said before I only performed this once, but it's not true. I actually performed it twice. So, and this was it happening in Taipei. Okay, so the last piece that I'm going to talk about is a piece from 2015, which is primarily a video piece, but I think of it as a kind of video performance that I did when I was just beginning this research that I've been doing for the past 5 years in Silicon Valley. I've been doing ethnographic research in Silicon Valley, trying to think about the way that Silicon Valley forms subjects, engages in this kind of process of subject formation that has to do with generating scenarios about the future and distributing and circulating those narratives and those imaginations. So this piece, Shoulder Babies, that I did was in the midst of that research, and it was when I was going to all of these events and talks and conferences and meetups in Silicon Valley. I lived in San Francisco at the time, and I would travel down to the peninsula of Silicon Valley and go to all these events. But I became sort of interested in the kind of marginal spaces of Silicon Valley, like the weird kind of liminal in between spaces, particularly spaces on the sides of freeways in Silicon Valley. And I think these spaces started to be interesting to me, partly because it seems like they almost shouldn't exist in this landscape that is trying to be, or supposed to be, kind of completely in service to the digital. But then there are these, like there is in any city, there are these kind of weird, little spaces on the side of the freeway or in overpasses, et cetera, where different things happen. So this piece that I made out of that, my first impulse was just to see, I wanted to spend more time in those spaces and see what happened. And what happened was that I developed this kind of almost quasi sci-fi narrative based upon this one character. And the narrative had to do with this speculative but possibly real future in which there were a couple of elements at play. And the first element was that there is ubiquitous surveillance. So there's a kind of ambient level of surveillance and nothing goes unsurveilled. And the second aspect was that people's web presences are completely monetized, so that you find that this sort of, social media culture or economy that we see now of like influencers and micro influencers becomes like a kind of whole multi-classes of existence. And so this character is this sort of slightly abject character who makes his living off of trying to 24/7 almost become this kind of meme. Like he's trying to become a meme so that he can develop value through his web presence. And at the same time, it's like he has given himself over to these sort of AI algorithmic scripts and scores that come to him that he doesn't really understand, but he tries to kind of enact and respond to in order to kind of make a living. So he's kind of like, he could be understood as this sort of hyperbolic form of a kind of gig worker whose whole life has been taken over by trying to create himself or kind of form himself as a digital presence. And what he's doing is that he lives in these kind of marginal or liminal spaces in Silicon Valley on the sides of the freeways, because he thinks that it will give him an advantage in his livelihood to try to get as close as he can to the Silicon Valley servers. And he doesn't really know why that might give him an advantage, but he suspects it might. So, and I think the thing with this piece is that I didn't really explain any of this narrative in the piece. I just tried to kind of embody the character and tried to see what would happen when I was in this space thinking as this character might think. And so I'm going to show you just a little excerpt from this piece. There's $1 million worth of...
What's your neck attached?
I'm gonna dig myself a hole.
What are you thinking about? Where's your head? Where did your head go? Did you lose your head again? What's your neck attached to?
See this? There's $1 million worth of magnesium in these 5 square yards. The one thing we need to do is keep the mining agency out of our fingers. They've got us. This is my turf. Everybody loves a baby. That is the ultimate baby of electricity. Sun and the moon, baby. Sun and moon and stars, baby. Woo-hoo! Sun and moon, baby. Woo-hoo! Sun and moon, baby. Like soft play. I will do anything anyone asks me. To myself, there were 5 people, there were some, they weren't that you would want them in for them to be. So I said to them, I said, you gotta, there's a copper filament if you're gonna be sparking, because in this day and age, you need to spark. Let's spark to park plan. On the one hand, you got mark to market. On the other hand, spark to park. Spark to park. No. Well, okay. That works as well. It's a ratio. If you set up a ratio, 3-to-1 equity to leverage. This is a word problem. 3-to-1 equity to leverage, park to spark, and to market. What do you got in your hand?
I see where this is going.
Yeah?
But I don't...
Take it down the road.
I don't know where to take it.
Unroll it down the road.
Intersection.
Oh yeah, keep it moving. Keep it going. You got it. Speed bumps.
There's green lights.
Yeah, yellow lights.
More green lights.
More green lights.
Red light.
Red light. Sorry, I was muted. One last thing that I want to say about that piece, Shoulder Babies, was that I was really trying to, and I think in certain ways that piece was a complete failure. But in another way, I really have a fondness for it. Partly because what I was trying to get at was that this character is responding to these cues from a kind of centralized AI algorithmic authority that's spinning out narratives in a sort of absurd way that a kind of individual human can't really understand, but is constantly trying to understand. And this character is living according to those narratives, is sort of forming their second-to-second existence on the basis of them. And so it was partly a narrative that made for the possibility of this kind of like fragmented absurdity that the character is seen trying to live. So yes, those are the 3 pieces that I wanted to share with you. And I think from that moving forward, I think this Shoulder Babies piece, it wasn't the last piece that I did before I went into these last 5 or 6 years of of deeper research into this book that I'm trying to write about the ethnographic research that I've been doing in Silicon Valley, an academic research project. And so where I'm at now in my process is trying to finish this dissertation/book project, which has to do with the way that Silicon Valley forms subjectivities on the basis of the kind of disciplining effect of future thinking and scenario planning. But I'm trying to see how all of this research that I've been doing how I'll be able to make future artwork about it, because it's partly research that I've been doing that exists for itself, but also, like most of my pieces, I imagine all of the research that I do as kind of culminating in performance pieces. And so what I was going to do for the rest of this talk was just going to give you a piece of the research that I've been doing on one of the chapters from the larger project, which is about the quantified self phenomena. It's ethnographic research that I've been doing into what they call the quantified self community. And what I'm really looking forward to is kind of sharing this research with you, and then possibly having conversation and taking questions about the content of the research, and definitely about these pieces that I've shown you, but also kind of brainstorming maybe with me about like what I might do from this research. So that said, I think I'm gonna give you this talk, and it's going to, I think, take about 20-25 minutes. I think we have time for that. And so, okay. So the title of this this chapter and this piece of research is Speculative Self-Management, Networked Accountability, Habit Capital, and the Quantified Self. The radical leftist European collective, the Invisible Committee, have argued in an essay entitled "Fuck Off Google" that we are now living in a kind of interregnum period. The conventional institutions of government, policy and lawmakers, electoral representatives, civic and state services find themselves unexpectedly beholden to, and have in fact come to be largely subsumed by, the massive and powerful digital communications platforms. We are in the midst of, they claim, the Invisible Committee claims, the slow collapse of political economy as an art of governing, which is coming to be replaced, they say, by the inherently apocalyptic governmentality of cybernetics, where what is sought is the perpetual self-regulation of systems through the unrestrained, transparent, and controllable circulation of information. This radical leftist group, the Invisible Committee, claims that one of the many problems with the messy changeover between a kind of older form of political economy and this newer form of cybernetic governmentality is that we, thus governed populations, are not yet quite caught up to the new form of government. We do not entirely yet grasp its ubiquity, its power, or its density. To draw on the political scientist Wendy Brown's reading of Foucault in her book Undoing the Demos, there is widespread denial that cybernetics has ceased to be only a normative form of reason and has become actual as a political rationality, which is to say that it establishes an order of truth by which conduct, our conduct, is both governed and measured. So because of this denial that we're in, the Invisible Committee argues, We are in a phase of instability, a historical opening where governmentality, where government, the possibility of being governed as such, its very possibility has come into question, if only temporarily. So in this analysis, the recent global resurgence, not so recent now, actually, it's been a long time, the recent global resurgence of far-right authoritarian nationalisms with their at-hand and seemingly ever-renewable ideological arsenal of racism, misogyny, anti-indigeneity, reactionary, viciously nostalgic, hyperbolic iterations of state, have in part come to fill a space left by industrial liberal political economies, which reigned over beings for a couple hundred years, at least theoretically, by letting them pursue their interests. So this is the idea of an epistemological gap that is coming to be, but is not yet entirely occupied by the new unofficial, not yet quite palatable paradigm, where the governed subject is, quote, the cybernetic conception of a being without interiority, of a selfless self, an emergent climatic being constituted by its exteriority, armed with its Apple Watch, which armed with its Apple Watch comes to understand itself entirely on the basis of external data, the statistics that each of its behaviors generates. So this idea of a vacated interiority exposes beings, us, to novel forms of control that begin to resemble older forms of governance by discipline, but with the difference that subjects, us as subjects, still affirmatively liberal in our orientation, take this discipline on quite willingly and enthusiastically as anxious attempts to know through endless iterative search functions our interior selves. So in a direct sense, the subjects of this talk and this ethnographic research that I've been doing, participants in a global community of people who call themselves the Quantified Self Movement, or QSers for short, could be said to be the poster children for the Invisible Committee's sharp and totalizing charge. In my own claims about this community, the QS community, I attempt to retain some of the Invisible Committee's critical spirit and quite a bit of their political contextualizing, while at the same time going beyond or coming down from the diagnosis of the quantified self as a being without interiority. So much depends, perhaps, on the metaphors a society uses to figure that special pastoral precinct, the inside of the self. My argument about the quantified self subject is not that it lacks interiority, but that the interior it does have requires a complex type of management geared toward the speculative future of knowledge production. True to its origin, it is a style of selfhood born in the cosmology of Silicon Valley, a cosmology that compulsively produces and performs representations of the future as a discipline. I also demonstrate that this interior is accounted for through networks of incentives, and that its relationality depends on its capacity to be economically nudged or almost imperceptibly modified over time by devices and algorithms. Finally, in the larger chapter, not as much in this talk, I argue that this interiority is conceived as a generator of unpredictable habits, a sort of stochastic core giving rise to automated behaviors too complex to be ascertained by the unaided senses, but are taken to be precious sources of value when they can be understood and controlled by the individual subject. So this is a dense set of arguments that I make here, I know, but my hope is that it will become clearer through demonstration. Overarching all of what I say here about the quantified self, though, is the perhaps more straightforward one that quantified selfers are perhaps best understood as virtuosic embodiments of the anxieties and ambivalences of lives lived in, through, and further into data sets and control systems based on data sets. That is, they expand and intensify what they give to networks as a form of projection of themselves. So to begin with, it is important for us to understand that this term quantified self has some slippage. It has a few different types of ways that it means. It's often called upon to signify in the news media a general condition of contemporary selfhood in which metrics, ratings, scores, probabilities, tabulations, come to be the primary or even vernacular methods of self-understanding. The media scholar Kate Crawford locates a key moment in this history of intensification of personal metrics in the early 20th century, when the weighing of the body on a scale passed from a public amusement at fairs and carnivals to a private domestic ritual, the quantifying of the weight of the self's body. Other scholars have identified turning points in the advent of educational testing, in the mid-20th century popular convergence of self-help and financial literacy. In the words of organizational theorist Eric Pezet, throughout the 20th century, quote, accounting has come to be not only a technique of producing data for decision-making, but also a social and political technique, a process whereby the subject is led to decipher and to recognize her or himself as a potential domain of knowledge. A threshold of 50,000 followers distinguishes a micro-influencer from an influencer on social media, a distinction that carries with it a not insignificant array of economic and social opportunities nowadays. Notification bubbles crowd our frames with digits that synthesize and signal the quantity of sociality we missed as we were, say, taking a shower or riding an airplane. Academic citations, mentions, shares, and views are logged and checked, and they influence salaries and tenures. One's credit score is a continuously updating number haunting or blessing one's livelihood. A sort of global gossip mill, part sci-fi, part reportage, murmurs about the emergence of a social credit score, which would account for much more than one's financial solvency merely, but would also integrate one's reputation, biological health, maybe one's genome, one's legal standing, and some measure of one's ethical conduct into a single figure. And on the back end, thousands of lines of individualized source code exist in places like this that you see in the slide, Facebook's data center in Prineville, Oregon, encoding such things as the relative distance between one's facial features, as demonstrated here in Artist and Quantified Selfer, is made these portraits of himself and two of his family members using framed blocks of Facebook's facial recognition templates pertaining to each of them. Here's a close-up of that. Portraits made out of code encoding facial recognition of himself and his two family members. So imagine viewing all of the metrics that pertain to you in one field of vision, which is a sort of holy grail project nowadays for many app developers. Perhaps the results would look something like the workstation of a financial derivatives trader, the dream of an all-purpose human dashboard, or to use the term cited in Quantified Self circles, computational life stream, is a dream of a fine-grained, semantically rich version of what the performance studies scholar Randy Martin called the financialization of daily life. Martin outlined in his late 90s work the new logics by which strange customs are made to feel normal. And he came to the conclusion that training towards a life more saturated by financial practices is ubiquitous but never automatic, and always requires action that leads towards self-recognition. That there's almost this dialectic between alienation and recognition of the self in what he called the financialization of daily life. To bring all of the aforementioned metrics with their various purposes, histories, and materialities together, and to imagine they constitute a unified rationality, was a position well articulated by the mid-20th century sociologist and Jesuit theologian Jacques Ellul when he argued that the telos of the human is inseparable from the telos of technique. The technique the rationalization and standardization of human practices has been and continues to become autonomous, self-augmenting, and universalized. Perhaps the updated and more accessible version of this broad position is a truism like, quote, data is the new oil. Or in other words, the organization and movement of our lives is in some sense propelled by the collection and storage of data bits. And here's a few kind of popular Silicon Valley kind of consultancy self-help books that deal with this idea. Of course, the metaphor of data as oil is not quite right, since oil combusts in its use, whereas data, well, what does happen to it? One idea is that it mostly piles up. Economists on the Berkeley campus a few years ago accounted for the total global storage of data and concluded that it has been growing at a rate of 66% per year, which is to say that it doubles every 18 months. This multiplication consists partly of what we give to networks. The word data in Latin is the past participle of the verb dare, to give. But it consists mostly of metadata visited upon what is given in the form of linkages, time and location stamps, and the results of algorithmic analyses. Some yet remaining critics of technology, including the Invisible Committee that I quoted earlier, argue that this growth of data represents a fresh stage of accumulation by dispossession, and that this time around what people are being dispossessed of is what Karl Marx called the general intellect, or the sum of human social knowledge practiced in an actually social way, person to person. But for now, in this talk, my aim is not so ambitious, and we may wonder just for a moment what becomes of such ambitions nowadays. Do they help one live each day and answer the demands that one communicate and coordinate competently, like over this Zoom call, for instance? My more constrained purpose is to discuss the other narrower signification of the quantified self, which is the movement of people or affiliation group, or in their words, taken from Pierre Bourdieu, sociologist, community of practice. People who self-identify and relate under the QS banner as committed self-trackers. My interpretation of these people, the quantified selfers, my understanding of their theoretical underpinnings and shared practices is based on observation and informal interviews at a number of meetups in Silicon Valley and San Francisco I attended between May 2017 and October of last year, and also on my attendance at their global conference in September of 2018 in the auditorium of a fancy conceptual design studio in Portland. These were their fancy chairs that they had in the auditorium. So a few basics. How do QSers track themselves? How do they produce data about themselves? Well, they use commercially available devices like Fitbits, Apple Watches, meditation, EEG headbands, smartphones, genome and biome self-kits, etc. They also use more specialized devices like electrodes, galvanic skin response sensors, blood glucose monitors, biometric scanners, motion sensors, accelerometers, and other kind of DIY medical devices. They also use analytical tools like spreadsheets, corpus linguistic analysis programs, and a huge variety of tracking apps, bots, and algorithms, many of which are produced and marketed or freely shared by QSers themselves. They also use wearable video, still, and surveillance cameras, as well as manual tools like written journals and a variety of traditional and non-traditional artistic mediums. The QS movement's primary genre of performance is the show and tell presentation. And these are little abstracts of show and tell presentations from their annual conference. In these show and tells, recorded on video and archived by the movement's co-founder, technology journalist Gary Wolf, and which now number in the thousands in their archive, presenters follow a strict formula, which is to answer 3 questions. What did you do? How did you do it? And what did you learn? These three questions help presenters articulate the motivations, methods, and results of what they refer to as N-of-1 experiments, or studies in which the sample size is one, and that one is oneself. The embrace of the N-of-1 experiment, the kind of genre of the N-of-1 experiment, is seen in quantified self circles as returning to the root of the scientific method, and its historical delegitimation in the scientific establishment has been detrimental to the progress of science, they claim. According to QSers, the benefits of self-experimentation are fivefold. First, it allows the experimenter, oneself, continuous long-term and inexpensive access to the experimentee, who is also oneself, which enables more fine-grained and longitudinal sets of data. Second, the possibility of ethical dilemmas is minimized. Third, multiple variables can be tracked, which is often impossible in multi-subject studies. Fourth, the will to carry through with an experiment is nearly always directly tied to personal and sometimes idiosyncratic intentions and purposes, a curiosity or desire or personal malady or discomfort that they're trying to cure or heal, which enables one to discover correspondences that fall outside the epistemological frame of both academic science and corporate research with their bottom lines, risk protocols, and feasibility limitations. In fact, many QS projects come to be practical critiques and even indictments of the short-sighted, profit-driven, imprecise designs and neglectful or exploitative data practices of tech companies that produce tracking tools. And finally, continuous real-time self-experimentation has the potential to, as it were, performatively enunciate different forms of embodiment and even whole new senses. An apocryphal story is the often cited case of a quantified selfer who constructed a compass belt outfitted with geomagnetic devices. At all times, the section of the belt facing north would vibrate. After wearing the belt for a month, the wearer supposedly had no need for it anymore, having constructed a reliably constant awareness of absolute orientation in space, similar, he claimed, to the migratory instincts of birds. So what do QSers track? Well, everything you might possibly imagine. In my observations, I have found that the majority of their tracking projects come under one or more of 10 or so categories. And here's the categories here. I'm not going to go into all of these, but a few points are worth mentioning for our discussion. First, that out of all these intersecting categories, it is most often productivity variables down here at the bottom. Productivity variables that are tracked alongside others in order to establish correspondences between productivity and other things that can be tracked in the self. So also the category near the bottom, all-encompassing, is my term for what are modes of self-presentation, perhaps unique to the QS movement, attempts to track and represent everything or nearly everything happening in one's body, mind, or life for a period of time. For instance, the image I used as the template for my first slide for the title page is a full frame view of this designer Nicholas Felton's, and he calls it his annual report, in which he tracks and catalogs a broad subset of his life activities for an entire year. Here, in this year's version of it, it's all of his communications via email, phone, etc. And then he designs these elaborate infographics, strikingly similar to shareholder reports produced by corporate firms, which he sells at the end of the year to his followers. He calls it the Feltron Report. And the Feltron Report was the first of what is now a whole genre of yearly and quarterly reports that individuals produce on themselves as design-heavy, rhetorical public documents on their lives and selves. All of the data of an entire year about some aspect of their life. As a result of these reports, Felton has become a sought-after and highly paid designer. Here we see that the strategic tracking and skillful design of information regarding one's habits and rhythms is convertible to reputation capital, self-tracking as a way to market oneself. So another such genre endemic to the QS is the minor trend of what they call the Maniac Week video. And I'm going to play you a little video of what this is for just like 30 seconds. And in the Maniac video mode, an individual attempts to work as many hours as possible in a single week. Usually the work is computer coding. And to document the entire duration, including breaks, through automated screenshots, which are then sequenced, sped up, and put to music as monuments to hyperproductivity. Part of the purpose of these videos is to produce for oneself a condensed, intuitively ascertainable form of proof that one is capable of making it through an intensified state of productivity. The repeated viewing of the video might then be imbibed as a sort of cognitive vitamin, similar to the geomagnetic belt. Eventually, the video would outgrow its purpose and become internalized as a new norm. So I feel like I'm running out of time, so I might just skip to the end and to the kind of skip a lot of the examples, unfortunately, and just go straight to the end just to take a minute to tell you kind of what I'm trying to get at with this research and maybe like start to explore some ideas of how I might be making this into a performance at some point in my life. So in a sense, the quantified self movement represents a culmination of what performance theorist John Mackenzie identified in his book, Perform or Else, as the overarching cultural economic trajectory of 20th century capitalism. The refinement of performance management through the development of scientific and computational techniques of tracking, measuring, and rewarding or not the performances of tasks. To conclude, we might consider the manner in which this performance management has transformed and intensified with the advent in the 1980s and 90s of neoliberal policies that weakened labor regulations and the negotiating power of unions in favor of direct contractual relations between employers and workers, rendering the latter a flexible and precarious workforce, individually responsible for piecing together economic stability from a variety of part-time gigs. In the last few decades, we have now witnessed this trend considerably intensified with the widespread use of data analytics, tracking and digital communication that makes the subcontractual basis of employment through digital microtasks more and more prevalent on platforms like Uber, Amazon's Mechanical Turk, Upwork, TaskRabbit, to name just a few. Each of these successive stages have required intensification and generalization of the discourse of self-management for the purposes of productivity, competition, and wage earning. And as a result, there is now a quite elaborate market for motivational techniques that offers various self-management tools to the hyper-flexible worker. If we follow this trajectory, we might hypothesize that what we see in the emergence of the quantified self is a recruitment of something like the whole self, the biological, cognitive, emotional self, etc., into management schemas. Such an all-encompassing conceptualization of productivity, recast as self-optimization, demands a virtuosic rationalization of one's own behaviors, rhythms, and states. And it also prefigures a conjectural condition described in a current batch of influential Silicon Valley management theories, which argue that the near future of work and achievement may entirely do away with the demand for conventional labor and wages due to eventual automation of even strategic and creative tasks. In their view, the new paradigm of productivity, of sustenance really, will be based almost entirely on people's skills leveraging their digital identities, or data doubles, and that any firm or organization not adept at helping cultivate and manage the rich data sets that individual lives present in their entirety will disappear in due time, phased out, as will those individuals who imagine they might resist networked visibility. So that's the end of my talk of this piece of research. And I want to leave some time for some discussion, questions, etc. Sorry, that went a little bit long. But I think you might be able to see there that the shoulder babies, that piece that I did, was really kind of prefiguring for myself this research. So yeah, I'll stop there and open it up. Thanks for bearing with me through all of that.
Thank you so much, Chris. It's amazing. It's such a gift to have someone bring their life's work, like all this research you've done, and then all of the synthetic ways you're making it important for us to be thinking about our current moment in history, and that's we're right in the middle of some kind of huge coming together of these elements. So it's really lovely. So what we're going to do, yeah, clap, clap, clap. There are 101 of us out here. What we'll do is we're going to turn off chat and move to Q&A. But what we'd like everyone to do is make sure that you write your questions down. In case we don't get to all of them, then you can bring them back to your programs for discussion. And so you have two ways of talking with Chris. One was to raise your hand, the blue hand, and the other is to write the question in Q&A. So, but we really encourage people to step up and actually speak. So we'll get that going. Sometimes it takes a minute. We're also gonna, if it's okay with you, Chris, we can stay over. So everyone that needs to leave at 1 can leave at 1, but we'll be here until 1:15 to further the discussion for those of you who want to stay. Great, thank you.
Yes.
Selena, go ahead and.
Hi.
Hi.
So I'm curious if you, when you're speaking to these quantified or seeing or engaging with the quantified self group, one of the things I was thinking was interesting is this possibility for adventure or sort of errantry, like discovery that they're doing. And it kind of seems like a pretty old American like theme, you know, a sort of old theme mapping onto this new frontier. Mm-hmm. Even the guy with the compass is the belt, you know, pushing north, I guess, is what he's doing. I wonder if you've thought of or experienced any other sort of adventurous, errant type profiles of these people. And if you have, like, what you think of that, or if you have any thoughts on that. And thank you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Thanks so much for that great question, Selena. It's a really good question. And I unfortunately, I went over on time, and so I didn't get to maybe talk about a lot of the examples of this work. So this gives me a sort of chance to talk about that. And I think it's totally true. I think you're right on with it in that a lot of these people, they see themselves as kind of maverick data scientists who are in many cases kind of going against the norms of the large platforms and app developers and kind of individualizing and customizing their own kind of experiments with themselves as well as with methods of data capture. And yeah, it's true. The magnetic belt thing is an example of that. There's a lot of like quite beautiful art projects that people make where they will gather data on themselves and quilt it or embroider it, do various, like they return to kind of various levels of kind of material or like sculptural representation of infographics. Trying to think of, there was a really amazing tracking project by a guy who is a black man, a queer black man who tracks microaggressions against himself, and also tracks his own biological emotional responses to them. And so he has this kind of amazing like quantitative narrative of kind of racial injustice that's perpetrated against him, which, you know, which is to say that there are all sorts of purposes that people put self-tracking to. It's, you know, it's not just kind of like this argument that I'm making about productivity. I'm saying that is kind of like a major genre that seems to inform a lot of the movement, but that it's a quite various palette of ways of going about it, and which is why I'm trying to kind of approach it as a more kind of like major sense of rationality about the self, rather than the kind of fringe movement that it may appear to be. If that answers your question.
It does. Thank you.
Thank you.
So there's a question in the Q&A from Kellyanne. Have you noticed an uptick in people tracking themselves since quarantine started, either more intense tracking from people who are already involved in quantified self, or more participation from people who hadn't been particularly involved with this before?
Wow, that's such a great question. And I must admit that I don't know what has happened since quarantine. Yeah, that's a really good question. And I want to find out actually what the answer is to that question. I imagine that it's probably all over the board, but one thing that the QS movement that I had been engaged in is that they really, really love gathering together in person and sharing their data like in a live sort of way with each other, even though then the show and tells are all archived, like I said. So I imagine that maybe some of the enthusiasm in the movement has waned a little bit since, but, you know, in terms of like making the data sets, and one thing that QSers say a lot is that like tracking the data is the easy part, but kind of interpreting it and representing it is the part that takes the most labor. And that's the part that also I think is the most fun for people. And so I imagine that there's probably been a huge increase in people's tracking, you know, but, you know, less maybe of a chance for people to actually then interpret those data sets with an audience in mind. But it's such a good question. I really want to know what the answer to that is. Thank you.
Miranda, do you have a question?
Well, I see Ian has a question. Maybe we can go to that one and then to Jordan.
Yeah, we've got about 3 hands up also, so. Should we do a hand? Let's do a hand next. Wrong. Go ahead.
Hey, yeah, I'm curious if your project were to data track something about your own life or your own self, what would that interest be for you? What would you want to track?
Yeah, that's a really good question also. I mean, part of the reason why I do a lot of the research that I do is that these ways of going about things are pretty antithetical to the way that I go about conducting my own life, which is why I then get a little bit obsessed with them in this sort of ethnographic way. So I don't track hardly anything about myself. I feel very untracked by myself, even though, you know, like I go about in my work. Of course, I'm tracked by other entities relentlessly. But one thing that I actually did, and I had to cut out this part of the talk because it was going so long, was that I actually, I used one of the apps that I can go back to this slide and show it to you real quick, just to give you a sense of what this is. I think it will help to look at the slide. So let me share my screen with you. So I tracked my progress in the production of this the talk that I just gave, using this one app called Beeminder. And I did this, this is not something that I would have done if I had not been doing this research, but I wanted to kind of see what it was like so this is like my writing of the talk. And what Beeminder does is it basically like, you give the app your credit card number, and if you don't reach certain word count limits, then it takes money out of your account. So it basically financially incentivizes you to get work done. The longer that you don't do it, it charges you more money. So basically, like in this, like you can see in this chart that at one point I had to pay the app $30. And then after that, it was going to go to $90. And that was really like, I didn't want to pay $90 to not do my own work. So I reached that goal. And the money that is collected by this app goes to pay the salaries of the web developers that create it. So it's this almost like this kind of motivational pawn shop, sort of, where you're sort of pawning your own like productivity practices to these app developers who are also they're all like PhDs in economic game theory. So that's a tracking process that I did engage in, but almost kind of on a perverse level for myself, to understand what this movement does. Yeah.
So I'm going to read off Ian's question, which is, first off, thank you for your work. Going off what you mentioned as a push towards what seems like, quote, total integration, unquote. Given your research, what might be, if any, a time frame until we see this universal data gouging of individuals as a culturally adopted force of exclusion to peoples and communities that already, quote, unquote, lag behind developed nations and communities?
Yeah. Great. Really, really good question. I would say, as to address the last part of that question, that's already something that's been happening on a wide scale. And my work doesn't necessarily like address that specifically. There are parts of it that do more than others. Exclusion from these sorts of data gathering practices and from the kind of value that accrues around them. I think it's already something that's been happening in a widespread way. I don't know. I think my work is more concerned with the generation of these ideas of speculation as a form, as a kind of like urge towards self-management, as a sort of governmental system. And I don't actually know what will actually happen with the kind of dreams and imaginations and prognostications that these different kind of Silicon Valley communities generate. My sense is that unpredictable happenings often get in the way of these kind of totalizing visions, but that the totalizing visions have a big effect politically and psychologically and economically on people in the meantime. That's kind of how I approach it, is more like that. One of the chapters that I am trying to write right now is about the idea of the technological singularity, and the way that how to put it, that the technological singularity seems to me like a kind of camouflaged form of white supremacist ideology, as a kind of alternative to a sort of regressive reactionary forms of white supremacy, but as a kind of technologically superpowered and kind of universalist idea of kind of white rationality. So that's one of the chapters that I'm trying to deliver like a, in my mind, kind of comprehensive critique of the quasi-eugenic ideology of the technological singularity that I think probably won't come to pass. It seems to me like a completely, they call like a fideistic or quasi-religious technological rational religion, but also at the same time has a big effect on both financial markets and people's ideas of the future. I hope that answers your question. It's a really good question. Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question, and then those that, at the 1 o'clock, if you need to leave after this question, and those that want to stay for more conversation can stay. So Olivia, you're up next.
Hi there. I just wanted to ask, because I find it so interesting what you're doing in your work. I do communications. That you talked about the QSers' enthusiasm for like doing these data tracking experiments, and what you brought up regarding the one gentleman with the belt, and like almost these self-help productivity apps, or adopting these hyper-productive digital workspaces. I'm really interested by this kind of uprise, almost in kind of Silicon Valley, like thinking of this like faux mindfulness or conscious narrativism, almost of like, I am being so hyper productive. I am following the expectations of what my workspace gives me, and thus I am a more fulfilled person.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Good point. Really good point. It's one of those things that's like, it's like a New Yorker cartoon, about like somebody like meditating really hard and tracking everything about it. It's like that, but it's also real, I've sat through a lot of show and tells about people very obsessively tracking their meditation practices and mindfulness practices. And I actually have a colleague in the rhetoric department here at Berkeley who has worked on the kind of history of the idea of mindfulness as in certain senses, kind of like more and more suiting itself or kind of engineering itself in the direction of datafication as a kind of subset of the kind of meditation like wellness world. And yeah, I think, it's on the one hand, like it's easy to make fun of, as I think a lot of these QS kind of self-tracking things are kind of easy targets in a certain way. But I've also seen talks where people, are tracking their meditation and it seems very effective for them. It seems like I've also, that said, also I've seen a lot of really amazing show and tells, people treating their own what's the word, like conventionally untreatable illnesses, and through self-tracking and coming up with pretty amazing results. Particularly there's a couple who worked on this. They're both diabetic, and they worked on like very, very fine-grained self-tracking of their blood glucose levels, and came up with a dialysis algorithm that has been kind of forcibly tabooed by the dialysis industry, because partly it's so effective and kind of like saves people so much money in insulin. So there's like a lot of really like, it's not like just bullshit what they're doing. And I think, to a certain extent, meditation could sometimes fold into that as well. Yeah.
Yeah, this is something that, like, to myself, like, I'm guilty of. Like, I have habit trackers. I meditate, I do yoga, I do all that. It's interesting to think about it in the consciousness of what other forms of data, because you were talking about spaces and the materialization of yourself in spaces, and like almost, what kind of person am I in a digital data space versus my actual self? There's like something lost in translation. Anyways, thank you so much.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks for those comments on that question. I mean, I think all of my work, all of what I get obsessed with comes out of the fact that there is so much lost in translation, and it's so hard to actually get down to describe what that is, and there's so many forces in Silicon Valley and in the kind of global complex that Silicon Valley is a major node of, that are producing kind of rhetoric and forms of discipline that are wanting to convince us that nothing is lost in translation, but that, it's all that's available, is the dataization of experience. So, yeah.
And I can also read.
Could you read them, Miranda? Do you mind?
Yeah. So there's one here from one of our colleagues, Suri, asking about research. Students often struggle with doing research. Can you share how the process was with you as you were emerging into your artistic practice? Were there hurdles you had to cross to embrace it at the level you do, or was research always part of your process? And then there's a question about quantifying the self before the digital age, and what did that look like? There's a question about whether it's curiosity that motivates you or a sense of civic responsibility. There's a really great question about mapping the development of cybernetic governance, why you choose to share your research findings through performance. Is there a connection to embodiment as rejection of the disembodiment of digital existence? And I'm drawn to that one only because it was related to a question that I had about looking at the difference between, because I feel like part of what you're arguing with bringing in Reich from earlier on is that the quantified self is not the same, is the disciplined self and not the same as the armored self of Reich's fascism. So those are, so I don't know if there's something there, maybe you want to speak to research, civic or responsibility or curiosity could connect with that. And then this notion of what is the history of this quantifying of the self for the digital age, and how does embodiment for you, sharing your findings through performance have to do with?
Okay, yeah, I can try to get at those. For great questions. Wow, this group has such good questions. It's amazing. First, to talk about research. Yeah, like I feel like all of my work is deeply researched. I think partly because it's like it just takes me a long time to understand something, and I feel like I have to understand things in a kind of multimodal, multi-experiential way for me to really start to make sense of it. I have to read a lot. There are times when I feel like I can't read, and I like to talk to people. That's my favorite thing, is to talk to people. And as I do my research, to take in sites, to go to conferences. There was a hurdle that I had to kind of get past, in that these Silicon Valley spaces to me at first seemed very forbidding. And also like spaces that don't necessarily welcome the kind of lay person. Like I'm not a technologist. I have no technical skills, or, I've gained some understanding of some technical questions, but mostly from a kind of sociological, philosophical, political point of view. And so I had to get over a sense that like, I wasn't supposed to be in these spaces. I wasn't supposed to talk to these people. I didn't know enough to do that research. I still struggle with that sometimes now, still when I'm writing, sometimes I struggle with like, God, who am I? Like, who am I to be writing about algorithms? I'm one of those people who has like dreams about like math classes from high school that like I didn't complete, like anxiety dreams about math. So I think my way into it really is, I think, a lot like I feel like I'm supposed to be there, or there's a reason for me to be there when I can really pay attention to strange convergences, juxtapositions between discourses and places, because I feel like that is a skill that I have, that I've developed through being an artist, really. And so, yeah, I think to move on to the question about before the quantified self movement, or before, digital culture became the primary mode of self-tracking, I mentioned a little bit like what's her name? Kate Crawford's work on the history of self-tracking, which had to do with, the scale. I mentioned that, the weight scale. But I would say that the primary prehistory of self-tracking through data, I think, has been in the field of accounting, personal accounting, but also I think pre-digital forms of self-care, of dieting. That's a big kind of forefront, I think, of like self-tracking has been the dieting industry. And over the past 10 years, some of the big kind of diet corporations have really been some of the first to move into kind of digital realms, Weight Watchers, etc. They have big data arms that they work with, create tracking apps, etc. Yeah. I would say also the prehistory has to do with, and this is something I had to cut out from this talk as well for purposes of time, is a kind of history of tracking the worker in industrial contexts, the history of Taylorism, tracking gestures. It's easy to make the leap from 19th century Taylorism, the surveillance of workers on the industrial floor, to the absolutely relentless and brutal tracking of Amazon workers in fulfillment centers. That's just like a totally straightforward history. That is, yeah. What was the third question, Miranda?
So that was about embodiment.
Embodiment.
In this work of mapping the development of cybernetic governance, why do you choose to share research findings through performance? Is there a connection to embodiment as a rejection of the disembodiment of digital existence? And maybe there's something here I was saying that connects with my question, which had to do with the difference between the way that the therapies that you described that Reich engaged with were supposed to dislodge fascist armors to undo fascism, and this kind of the discipline through quantification of the kind of, I guess, neoliberal subject.
Yeah. Both really good questions. So the embodiment, like, yes, hands down, yes, there's a relation there. And in all the ways that I think you articulated very well, resistance to disembodiment, but also a kind of dialectical struggle with ways in which embodiment is inscribed and disciplined by digital systems, economic systems, techno-social systems. The way that those two are in a really uneasy relationship with each other, that's, I think, what most of my work is doing, basically exploring that friction. And with regards to the disembodied subject, or the self-tracked, speculatively self-managed subject, and the fascist armored body, that's something I've been really curious about and struggling with a bit lately, partly because I think the world that we live in that is techno-socially structured and influenced, and the forms of embodiment that we arrive at through that are all over the board in all these different ways, and I don't know if we fully understand them. And then also, like, the fascist right has its own critique of this, and I think has been coming out more and more against it. Like, just this past weekend in San Francisco, like, the Proud Boys were nominally, like, at least partly, like, protesting at the Twitter headquarters here in San Francisco. And partly that has to do with the fact that they feel unfairly censored by Twitter for, circulating hate speech. But also, within these conspiratorial discourses of QAnon and everything, there's a large discourse of kind of like quasi-Matrix-esque anxieties and fears about the dataization of lives. And so there's something weird and not yet quite understood happening right now, I think, about the convergence of kind of neoliberal forms that we inherit, economic, technosocial forms, fascist upwellings, and then what we might talk about as a radical or a left or a kind of, critique of technology that is attuned to both its possible benefits and its considerable forms of kind of control and discipline. It's a complex territory right now that I'm trying to write through and haven't quite come to terms with. So thanks for that.
Yeah, it's super important right now. Really important for us to be thinking about all these things right now. So we just want to thank you so much for joining us, for being with us. Like I said, we need you. We need people talking about these ideas that they're putting all of their time and energy into and sharing them with us. It's very deep, thoughtful work. All of you who have not had your questions answered, keep them and bring them to your programs. And if you can all unmute yourselves, let's applaud that we would do. In a very glitchy way.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm honored to be here, and thank you so much for taking all this time to listen to my rantings. Yeah.
Thank you, Chris.
Great.
Thanks.
Come and see us when we can move around.
I will be thrilled to do that.
Okay, great.
Yes.
Okay, lovely.
Take care,
Thank
everyone,
you.
and you'll be well.
Bye.